around saying British jobs for British workers. And I think the guy has very, very little credibility, but he excites a lot of sentiment in the Scottish Labour ranks and maybe some of the voters as well, but it has to be critiqued.
And there was another slightly odd thing I noticed, or another extremely odd thing I noticed, he said. He said, we need to state the purpose clearly of the union. We need to have a nation with a sort of, statement. Is it like a sort of slogan? Is it like, the real thing? Well, I mean, what? I can't think of a nation that actually has a codified statement of purpose. It seems very odd to me. How do you think such a thing... I'm at a loss for words because I don't know what he wants from that. And if you did have to state the purpose of your nation... What possible thing could you say?
We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Yeah, you got it.
That's the way you do it. And quite often, I suppose, you see in constitutions, like the Swedish constitution has an extensive preamble of general principles.
That's a statement of principles. It's not a statement of purpose. That's different.
Well, no, I would say they're not. I would say that they're. It's an exercise in practical reason. It's not just abstract principle for abstract principle, but it's with the view to the progressive realization of those principles in society. The more perfect union, as they say in America. I think that's kind of the perspective. I mean, Pat's reference to Mayor Nora Rochwind, actually, I know the authors of that site, and you're quite right. They are kind of young Labour members who are pro-independence, who really have I don't want to speak for them unfairly, but my understanding of their views is essentially that nationalism is an inadequate basis for politics, and ultimately there has to be some sort of class analysis in there, and the absence of that in contemporary Scottish nationalism is the reason why they're still in the Labour Party.
It's a good point.
So I think that's the kind of core of the core of their argument, and I think they're quite sort of suspicious of some of the movements you're seeing now towards the sort of the Nordic horizon type stuff, the common weal argument, because again I think they would argue that there's an insufficient sort of Marxist class analysis in there to carry for a real analysis of work and the experience of workers and that kind of thing, and that being an important dimension of how politics actually works.
James?
Well, just listening to what was said, obviously I didn't hear what Gordon Brown said, but I was wondering if perhaps what was going on was because he realises essentially if you vote for the United Kingdom, you're essentially voting for Tory governments 2/3 of the time. He's trying to sort of find a way of squaring the circle and saying, well, if we put it in the constitution that there has to be certain social democratic values. I mean, it sounds very implausible. And also, I did read, I think it was in Wings Over Scotland, there was, I think, a reference to what Gordon Brown said about entrenching devolution, and the point made was that couldn't be done because no government can bind a successor. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. I think Gordon Brown is probably correct that, there is a way of entrenching devolution so that Westminster Parliament couldn't repeal its powers. I think that is perfectly possible. You can't repeal Australian independence, for example.
No, but I mean, it is possible, James, but it's possible within very limited parameters. And one of the preconditions of doing it is that we totally transform UK constitutional law. Now, that's doable. Let's not be pessimistic about that. If we get a no vote in 2014, I'll be arguing up front with all of the rest of the Federalists that we need to radically reform the British Constitution. As you say, they can't in reality repeal Australian independence, but legally they could do so.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no, legally they could do so because Parliament is sovereign. That's at the core. Parliament can do anything. Parliament can legislate to transform a man into a woman if it wants, and that's kind of one of the core constitutive principles. I mean, Tom Nairn described it as being the sort of central foundation myth of the British state, and I think he's right. I think it still is. I think it's still a kind of totemic idea, which really, if we're going to get federalism in the UK, we have to obliterate.
But the real twist in this is that independence is probably the fastest route to a federal remainder of the UK that you can get. I mean, the convulsion that a yes vote will cause, the way that England will have to start thinking about its constituent parts between the north and the south and between regional devolution and having to deal with the power of London. When my comrade Billy Bragg says this all the time, and many other people actually, Neil Lawson of the Compass Group, which is a kind of a left of centre group floating around the Labour Party in London, is absolutely desperate for Scottish independence because he thinks it will cause the turbulence that's required to get, the constitutional politics, the Charter 88 politics that have run into the ground, post the coalition and certainly post AV, and get them back ignited again and get the progressive forces in England trying to build the majority that is there. But a lot of them think that it's the convulsion of an independence that will actually help the British state reform itself, not some no vote and some belief in musty incrementalism from just on the side of the Thames. It's not going to happen.
I'm going to have to still continue to be pernickety, and I don't think a statement of principles is the same thing as a statement of purpose. But there you go. But okay. But the interesting thing you're talking, Pat, there about the progressive element, trying to get that going in England, because a mantra I've heard quite a few times from Better Together in recent weeks. Sarwar said it a couple of times. Gordon Brown said it, which is this pooling of resources. Pooling resources is better for everyone. We have to pool our resources in the United Kingdom. It's been a mantra. But I'm not sure of the value of a phrase like pooling resources, or the value of pooling your resources, when for the last 40 years, we've been seeing a massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. I don't see what pooling of resources actually does for us. I'll go to Pat with that first.
Not a great record in terms of pulling the resources on the usage of oil, for example, over that period of time. We managed, somehow to get a vote averting a war in the Parliament a few weeks ago. But how many ones have we been dragged into? If Labour MPs in Scotland, have sort of consistently voted to the left of their party, trapped in a Westminster system, that means that under insufficient devolution, certainly without independence, they've not been able to defend their natural constituency against years and years of deeply founded, deeply better together Westminster policies. And it's worse. It's actually worse at the moment. The actual policy consensus between Labour and Tory through the Westminster system around about things like welfare, austerity, the scope of spending, you're doing welfare cuts correctly rather than doing them incorrectly is noxious, So the whole idea that risks are pooled, actually threats are pooled as well. And I mean, that's the battle that has to be won. I picked up a couple of columns that I sent through to you guys. Quite an interesting discussion, between Stephen Noon on one side and the Scotsman saying we need to think about a cooperation of nations. James Mackenzie on the Better Nation blog saying, no, I quite enjoy being a separatist because I want to be separate from this, separate from NATO, separate from that, separate currency, of a more of a left take on independence. That's a proper debate that we're having in the Yes campaign. Classic perspective from an SNP leadership take. You're dividing. If you give people three options, they'll choose none of them. So this is one of the most interesting aspects of this, is that I find myself, on a certain part of the ideological spectrum, but I'm hearing from the other side, from erstwhile comrades in the 2011, 2007 SNP leadership elite, that we're actually blurring the mindset by having these debates. I can't go with that. I feel we're being proper citizens by having these debates, not by shutting them down,
Yeah, well, I mean, to go back to what you said initially about the pooling of resources things, I suppose there's two different readings you can have of it from a Better Together strategic point of view. On one hand, you have the wealthy Scots argument that it would be selfish to have the kind of it's Scotland's oil argument, but I don't think that's really the one they're making. I think it's an indirect way of playing to people's anxieties, understandable anxieties about the affordability of independence. Would my pension still be there? Would my etc. 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 And so it's an indirect way of playing to anxieties about being too poor.
I think pooling your resources, I think if that means a sort of equal distribution of resources, then it depends on convincing people that you can somehow stop the Conservative Party from winning elections. That's the sort of credibility gap that the No campaign have got. How do they persuade people that what has happened for the last 60 years is suddenly going to stop happening, and that a left of centre government will be in power at least a reasonable amount of the time? And I don't think they're going to really convince people of that.
Yeah, the transfer of wealth from poor to rich has continued under successive Labour governments as well. It's been the thing.
I think Andrew's point is absolutely correct, and I think it's one of the most difficult things to think through in the indirect debate is the idea of how you assert an independent national sovereignty and almost have the confidence to use it as a bargaining chip in various circumstances. And for example, are we viable to maintain and guarantee pension security, or are we able to maintain and guarantee the viability of a separate currency? I do think that, and it's already happening. I mean, if other people are bringing this argument, but I do think some of us have to know that these things have been thought about and that they are prepared to be brought into a negotiating position with the British state, rather than trying to sort of assert that the British state will go along with, a currency union, or will go along with sensible harmonised relations between things like, welfare and other matters. I feel a bit like a fundy in this, but I sort of feel as if we do have to have a somewhere in the plan, and maybe it happens out with the SNP, maybe that's what the radical left and the India left is for. We have to be thinking about an independence that does countenance a degree of horrible, capital D word, disruption, or at least a period of uncertainty. And then we have to figure out how to have the confidence to get from one state of affairs to the other. One can derive that confidence by talking until you're blue in the face about other nations that have made the same shift. For example, say, Czechoslovakia and breaking into Czech Republic and Slovakia, and we can school the debate on that. We can teach people that it's not a terrible process. But I think if we don't risk the idea that to be independent means being extremely capable and up for it citizens, there's a weakness in the general front there on the independence argument. We have to have the confidence of quite a classical idea of being independent in order that we cut a good deal on interdependence.
Andrew?
Yeah, it's a troubling one and a tricky one, I think, this question about sort of being this, I called it in the past in a whimsical moment, being the cartographers of a new Scotland, and who should paint the maps, and how many maps should we have, I suppose, is the question. And I haven't resolved in my own mind really how best strategically this should be approached from a kind of Yes Scotland point of view and from an SNP point of view, if we want to kind of use those two as a kind of polarities in terms of the yes argument. I think there is probably a place for the SNP being very prescriptive about what it wishes to do, because I think actually I think you're right, Pat, that confidence is important. I think it's going to be a scary, risky feeling for people to become independent anyway. There's no point pretending that isn't the case, because that is the case. So there has to be ways of dealing with risk. But I think on the other hand, I'm quite skeptical about this idea that what we need is more explicit radicalism from the yes side. I don't really see in the Scottish people a great hunger for that. I think I'm more convinced, I suppose, by the argument that the independence is scary enough already for most Scots, considering, if you look at the polling, most Scots float a bit, but it's going to be a tough job to convince people, and I think the way to do that is probably primarily a sort of a reassurance kind of game, because I think that just at the moment, at this early, probably too early confrontation of Scottish nationalism with the kind of referendum moment, I think that's probably the only kind of independence we'll be able to achieve. Not an Independence Day on the sort of 19th of September 2011. It won't be one, I think, of great rushes of enthusiasm of people on the streets. It's gonna be. It wasn't
the last time in 1999. It was a catatonic day, as I remember it.
Yeah, it'll have to be. I think it'll be independence with a shrug, independence with a sod it, if you like, which is quite a reassuring thing. But I think sod it independence is what we need, and I inch more towards the Eckley SNP leadership safety strategy more than I move towards the kind of radicalism woohoo. Let's talk about nationalising, X, Y, and Z. I'm not quite sure that's the way forward.
It's not the way forward, but Yes Scotland is designed to be an umbrella for a lot of energies, So I think a lot of what people criticise about Yes Scotland is that it's diffuse, it's blethery, it's soft, it's capacious, it reduces itself down to three principles, democracy, prosperity and fairness has to be the strength of it, because there is a lot of free-floating aspiration and idealism around in Scotland. How you harness it such that it doesn't self-destruct is an interesting question, and certainly one of the things I think that now that we've argued ourselves to a kind of fact standstill, I think that's what you could say about the Sturgeon and Sarwar debate last night. We may need to move into more cultural aspects, but there's two bits of demography. One, the missing million, the working class voters who are totally into independence, totally into quite a radical version of independence, but just don't turn up to elections. So that's one constituency that has to be kind of gotten out. And I think you have to think about how women get on board with independence, and I think you have to find ways to. The community campaign is crucial in that respect. Women are usually driving community bonds more than men, and so the whole community dimension of Yes Scotland, where you actually go out and almost, as it were, revive citizenship. You know, I think that's a lot of what the community campaign Yes Scotland is about, is actually addressing a fundamental passivity that's in political modernity, about people just turning up, switching on, going to sleep, getting up to work again. I mean, there's a structural passivity that we all have to fight against in modern societies. And I think one of the things that the Yes Scotland campaign is trying to do through its community thing is to revive citizenship, face-to-face, demos, polis, Greek, classical citizenship. And we've got extra tools with new media and so forth. But I think that's one of the